Let's start.
Anaerobic respiration, lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. When oxygen levels are low, such as during a sprint, your body will attempt to create more energy anaerobically. Because the products for glycolysis eventually run out, there is a secondary process called fermentation that helps to replenish those products. During fermentation, the pyruvate made during glycolysis converts to lactic acid, which can build up in your muscles, causing soreness and fatigue.
So, simple, what happens is that during a sprint or during vigorous or during heavy exercise, such as a sprint, your body will create more energy anaerobically. Why? Because the rate of respiration or the breathing that providing oxygen is not enough to go muscles to undergo aerobic respiration. Why? Because you need quick source of energy. So quick source of energy and the depth of oxygen or the less of oxygen, your body, your muscles, mainly, instead of going aerobic respiration, simple, they will do anaerobic respiration. From previous lesson, glycolysis, which is a product of glycolysis, which is pyruvate, will run out. Secondary process called fermentation will take place. The idea is that even if there is lack of oxygen or there is less amount of oxygen, you can continue your exercise, but of course with some disadvantages like producing lactic acid, because the product of anaerobic respiration now we are going to see is production of lactic acid. From its name, acid causes the burning or soreness and fatigue of the muscles. It happens with everyone during long exercise, during heavy exercise. The last minutes, of course, it is a time that you are trying to give up. It is a time that you are trying to give up. You feel that you are getting tired or you feel that you are not able to continue, but of course, because of a game, simple, you cannot just quit. So you will do your best just to continue. Meanwhile, in your muscle cells, there is accumulation of lactic acid. Why? Because your body now is not doing aerobic respiration, it's doing simple anaerobic. Accumulation of lactic acid, from its name, the acid causes soreness of muscle, or you can feel the burning sensations of your muscles. And of course, at the end, even if you didn't give up or even if you continue by force, simple, you might have muscle cramping. Of course, once you have a cramp, you have to give up or you can continue the exercise. Let's go and see two types of respiration, lactic acid and alcohol fermentation. So anaerobic is divided into two groups, lactic acid and alcohol fermentation. Why? Because simple, in eukaryotes it goes lactic acid fermentation, in prokaryotes or microorganisms it goes to alcohol fermentation.
Anaerobic respiration, lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. Some cells can function for a short time when oxygen levels are low. Some prokaryotes are anaerobic organisms. They grow and reproduce without oxygen. In some cases, these cells continue to produce ATP through glycolysis. However, there are problems with solely relying on glycolysis for energy. Glycolysis provides only 2 net ATP for each molecule of glucose, and a cell has a limited amount of NAD+. Glycolysis will stop when all the NAD+ is used up if there is not a process to replenish NAD+. The anaerobic pathway that follows glycolysis is anaerobic respiration, or fermentation. Fermentation occurs in the cytoplasm and regenerates the cell supply of NAD+ while producing a small amount of ATP. The two main types of fermentation are lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation.
So, some cells, as you can see, simple, they can continue with low level of oxygen. Example, prokaryotes are anaerobic organisms. They grow and reproduce without oxygen. This is how they are adapted. Simple, they can do anaerobic or they can survive respiring anaerobically. Some cases in our cells, problem relying on glycolysis. Why? Because we saw that glycolysis produces only 2 ATP, right? We saw when glucose is broken down into the cytoplasm, it generates only 2 pyruvate, 2 NAD+, and only 2 ATP molecules. So of course, this 2 ATP molecule is not enough to carry out the process or exercise or whatever it is for a long time. Here, as you can see, it says net 2 ATP for each molecule of glucose. And of course, 2 ATP, that means only 2 NADH. Why? This is a product of glycolysis. So anaerobic glycolysis, is the part of both aerobic and anaerobic processes. Glycolysis, which takes place in the cytoplasm, is the first stage of both aerobic and anaerobic processes. Of course, glycolysis will stop when all NAD+ is used up. So of course, if there is no NAD+, it will not produce NADH. Or if all NAD+ are used up, or you don't have NADH in the body, of course, simple, there is no glycolysis. Why? Because glycolysis will use or will take this NAD and it will convert it into NADH. If there is no NAD+, there is no glycolysis. So anaerobic pathway, they give another name, alternative name for anaerobic is fermentation. What is fermentation? Process which NAD+ is regenerated, allowing cells to maintain glycolysis in the absence of oxygen. So simple, you can say another name of anaerobic respiration is fermentation. Another name of anaerobic respiration, we call it simple fermentation. We have two types, alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. So fermentation, of course, because it is anaerobic process, of course, it's going to take place cytoplasm and regenerates NAD+ and a small amount of ATP. This small amount of ATP refers only to ATP molecules. Why? Because we said fermentation is same as glycolysis or anaerobic, only 2 ATP molecules. Of course, these 2 ATP molecules is not enough to produce enough, or is not enough to continue the exercise, or is not enough to continue whatever organism is trying to do.
Lactic acid fermentation. In lactic acid fermentation, enzymes convert the pyruvate made during glycolysis to lactic acid. This involves the transfer of high-energy electrons and protons from NADH to lactic acid molecules. In the process, NADH is converted to NAD+. Skeletal muscles produce lactic acid when the body cannot supply enough oxygen, such as during periods of strenuous exercise. When lactic acid builds up in muscle cells, muscles become fatigued and might feel sore. Lactic acid also is produced by several microorganisms that are used to produce many foods, including cheese, yogurt, and sour cream.
So, as you know, most of the reactions are carried or done by the help of the enzymes. So during lactic acid fermentation, enzymes convert the pyruvate, which is done during glycolysis, simply into lactic acid. You know that during aerobic respiration, pyruvate must be converted into acetyl-CoA in order to enter the Krebs cycle. But because there is no oxygen or because there is lack of oxygen, so the enzyme, instead of converting pyruvate into acetyl-CoA, simple, they will convert them into lactic acid. Simple, by producing NADH and 2ATP. Here that involves transfer of electrons, NADH to lactic molecules. NADH is converted back into NAD pluses. Mainly it happens in our skeletal muscle. Just to remind you, skeletal muscles are muscles that attach to the bones, such as biceps, triceps, okay, hamstring. So the skeletal muscle during exercise, lactic acid, when the body cannot supply enough oxygen. Keep in your mind, you cannot say there is no oxygen, not enough oxygen that is needed for the cell or for the muscle cells to continue aerobic respiration. Such as, gave you an example here, strenuous exercise or heavy or vigorous exercise. As we saw last time, accumulation of lactic acid in muscles cause muscle soreness, fatigue, and feel sore. Yes. Not only in animals, lactic acid is also produced several organisms that use to produce many foods, including cheese, yogurt, and sour cream. In the chapter of bacteria, when we took useful bacteria, we said we use bacteria just for production of the foods such as cheese, yogurt, sour cream. So all these processes done by fermentation, of course, using bacteria or using microorganism in order to have for production of the cheese, yogurt, and sour cream. Just simple example. In the milk, for example, milk contains lactose sugar. Lactose is a sugar that is found in the fresh milk. So they add some bacteria, or by the help of bacteria, of course, anaerobic respiration, that means the tank or the fermenter or the place that reaction is taking place must be covered in order to provide contact with oxygen or to reduce or to remove the oxygen, so the tank must be covered. So bacteria will respire anaerobically on the lactose sugar. That means bacteria will convert lactose sugar into lactic acid. That's why if you compare the taste of the sugar to the taste of the milk, taste of the yogurt to the taste of the milk, you will find that, or if you check the pH also, that the yogurt has low pH than milk. Why? Because the pH of the acid, from its name lactic acid, yogurt is more acidic than just simple milk. This is just as example of lactic acid fermentation. Alcohol fermentation, of course, from its name, alcohol fermentation not take place in organisms, I mean in humans or animals. Simple, the process of producing an alcohol.
Alcohol fermentation occurs in yeast and some bacteria. During alcohol fermentation, pyruvate is converted to ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. Similar to lactic acid fermentation, NADH donates electrons during this reaction, and NAD+ is generated.
So alcoholic fermentation mainly done in yeast and bacteria. As we said, not in humans or in any animals. So simple, this process is done some in yeast and bacteria. Same, pyruvate will be converted instead of lactic acid. Now it will be converted into ethyl alcohol or simple ethanol. Ethyl alcohol is the same as ethanol plus carbon dioxide. So this is the main difference between lactic and alcoholic fermentation. In lactic, pyruvate converted into lactic acid plus NAD plus. In alcohol fermentation, pyruvate converted into ethyl alcohol or ethanol plus carbon dioxide. Now we are going to see the main difference between lactic and lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentations. Let's go through them. Here, as you can see, pathways, the first thing that we did till now, pathways. First one is lactic acid, the second one is alcoholic fermentation. Here, in lactic acid, glucose, we said, by glycolysis converted into pyruvates. Glucose converted into 2 pyruvates. Of course, plus 2 to NADH, those are constant, and 2 ATP, those are similarities in both. Now, if there is lack of oxygen or not enough of oxygen, pyruvate, by the help of enzymes, will be converted simple into 2 lactic acids. Simple pyruvate will give you 2 lactic acid. Let's go to the alcoholic fermentation. In the beginning, the same glycolysis is common process, 2 ATP to NADH plus 2 pyruvate. This is simple glycolysis. Now, in yeast and some bacteria, pyruvate, by the help of enzymes, simple will be converted into carbon dioxide and ethanol. Ethanol is the same as ethyl alcohol that is mentioned in the text. So this is the main difference between alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation. From their names, they will produce lactic acid, they will produce ethanol. Ethanol is chemical name of alcohol. All alcohols, you should know later on, in chemistry they ends by ol. Ol, that means we are talking about alcohol. Ethanol, propanol, methanol, all refers to an alcohol. This is the functional group of alcohol. All. So let's see second difference between them. Second difference. Production, as we said, produces lactic acid, produces here lactic acid. Here, what do they produce? Produce all ethanol and carbon dioxide. Here, NADH converts to NAD+. Here, pyruvate converts to alcohol and carbon dioxide. This is common. Pay attention for common things. Those two processes are common. NAD+ converts to NADH. NAD+ converts to NADH. This is what we saw that it is common in both. Now, where does takes place? Lactic acid in animals, such as skeletal muscle cells in animals. What about the alcohol in yeast and some bacteria or certain bacteria? Not all bacteria, they do alcoholic fermentation. What about lactic acid? Microorganisms are used to make foods such as cheese, yogurt, and sour cream. So the main difference is that alcohol, only microorganisms such as yeast and bacteria. Lactic acid, done in animal and some bacteria or some microorganisms as comparison table.